everyone, and welcome to another episode of Breaking Barriers for Inclusive Manitoba, which is a project launched by U Multicultural. So thank you, U Multicultural, for giving us a platform where we could have conversations that uplift the topics or discussions on accessibility and universal design, as well as inclusion. Today, we have a very special podcast session. This conversation includes our amazing guests who are from Government of Manitoba. So we have Darren and Lucia. Darren is the director of Manitoba Accessibility Office.
Correct, yeah.
And Lucia is the assistant director for Accessibility Compliance Office. Is that correct?
Yep.
So why don't you introduce yourselves to our audience?
Thanks for having us. I just want to say, first off, thanks for doing this. A big part of our agenda at the Manitoba Accessibility Office is promoting accessibility. And by that I mean promoting accessibility is not one person's job. It's not just government, that we need to have organizations, businesses, municipalities get involved. So things like this, it's amazing that you're doing it, and certainly happy to be here and participate. As you said, I'm Darren Macdonald, and my role is the Executive Director at the Manitoba Accessibility Office, and we can talk a bit about what my office does. But my background, I'm a social worker, and I didn't start off working in accessibility or even human rights or legislation. I started off in direct service. So my background, starting way back in the 90s, was working with children with disabilities in the school system. So I learned about barriers and accessibility sort of on the front lines, and seeing the barriers that children faced in schools. And it at the time I was taking a different program, but it convinced me that I wanted to go into social work and work with people with disabilities. So that's sort of where my career started. I got a job with government, and I was working with people with disabilities more in the income support stream and helping folks find employment. And so again, witnessed firsthand the barriers that people face accessing employment or accessing government services and those types of things. So half my career was in direct service, working with people with disabilities. And for me, I think that's where I cultivated a bit of an identity as an ally, and I still have that, and I wish to be an ally and support people with disabilities as much as I can. So 3 years ago, I moved from income support into the Accessibility Office, and now we look after raising awareness. We work on accessibility laws in Manitoba, and we have a lot of great projects on the go. So happy to be here and talk about accessibility in Manitoba.
That's incredible. Thank you for the introduction. All of these are important topics, though. I am so glad that you have that rich background, which is definitely essential when you're working with people with lived experiences. Lucia, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Lucia Madariaga, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Accessibility Compliance Secretariat, which is an office. It's separate from Darren's office, but we do work quite closely together. And as we were talking, my background, I studied political science and began to work in government 13 years ago as a policy analyst. But what I think really got me interested in working in the area of accessibility was I had done some work with refugee newcomers in Winnipeg, and many of them had disabilities. And I was really interested in that intersection between settlement to Manitoba and disabilities, and how to serve refugee newcomers who had disabilities. I'm also someone who has a non-apparent disability myself. So I've seen over the course of the years how that affects me. So I have some personal experience with a disability, and I've just always been interested in human rights issues. So that's my background in a nutshell.
Lovely, especially the intersectionality part. And you talk about refugees, it's similar to immigrants as well, who basically, when they come here to Canada, how important it is for us to talk about those topics where settling down could be really challenging. It's not just for, what we call as normal or the ableist approach, how difficult it could be for a person who has a disability and they're living with certain lived experiences. So this is amazing. Your backgrounds are rich, and I'm so happy to have you both here. Thank you so much for coming. Now we will dive into some of these conversations. I mean, we did talk about policy and analysis. So of course, policies would be our topics. Let's talk about our policymakers. We know that we usually talk about the barriers that persons with lived experiences experience on a daily basis. But we have to talk about, which seldom gets missed, the barriers that our policymakers, our decision makers also face. I understand that we are, still not there, but there are so many efforts happening. And I have to mention that even though Manitoba might have started later than some of the bigger provinces within Canada, but right now, Manitoba is leading in so many different aspects when it comes to initiating, practicing disability-related initiatives, and policies and standards are one of those. Well, standards, we still need to update some of those. So I would like to know from both of you, from your departments, people that you work with, and of course that involves different professionals, expertise that gets into it, and of course different stakeholders, because they are the most important people, organization, voices. So what barriers would you both want to share?
Well, it's a great question, and I don't want to lose it. I'll get back to it, but I think it's important when we're talking about policy and legislation and barriers that we face. I think, it's important to kind of go back a little bit. You mentioned other provinces and how Manitoba is leading the way, and we'll talk about that. And I want to talk about the positives of Manitoba, but of course acknowledge that Manitoba is not barrier-free. We're not perfect. There's barriers out there, and certainly that's a topic. That's another podcast series, I think, hearing from people with lived experience about the barriers they face.
Right.
But as far as the policy piece, you could go back, and I'm not going to go back to the Magna Carta, British laws of 1200 or whatever.
Yeah.
But in Canada, I think really the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, 1982, I think it was passed, is really a pivotal keystone legislation. It's the piece of legislation that protects us from discrimination.
Oh, yes.
Right? So it protects us religious discrimination, sex, sexual orientation, and disabilities included in that. So that's passed in the 80s, and some time passes. The next pivotal thing I feel in history was the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So this happened in about 2006, and in 2010, Canada signed on. So what that means is now for the first time, you have this convention at the UN, you have all different countries, organizations, stakeholders, and people with lived experience are there. And they come up with about 50 articles that are the rights of people with disabilities. It covers many areas of life. Some basic fundamental freedoms like freedom of life and freedom to choose and those types of things. And it also talks about accessibility, and it talks about where some of our laws come in, employment and some of those other pieces, right? So that's sort of, you've got the Human Rights Code, then you've got this convention at the UN, Canada signs on, that's 2010. 3 years later, Manitoba passes the Accessibility for Manitobans Act.
Yes.
So this gives Manitoba its broad legislation. I think that's safe to say. It gives us powers to pass regulations, which helps because for those that don't know, an act is very broad. Regulations, for us policy people, we like the regulations because that gets into the nitty gritty.
Exactly.
Yeah. So then in Manitoba, we identify 5 key areas of life where barriers exist and where we want to focus legislation to remove barriers. Mm-hmm. So we pass accessible customer service regulation, accessible employment. Followed thirdly by accessible information and communication. Mm-hmm. Then we passed just recently accessible transportation, and we're working on the 5th one around the built environment and focusing right now on the outdoor built environment. So
exciting.
it's very exciting, and I think it paints a bit of that picture of, you know, where we've come. So 1982, for some of us, doesn't seem that long ago, but for the two of you, I'm sure you don't remember it. But really in my lifetime, we've seen that momentum. We've seen the change legislatively, and like lots of social change, the laws come in. It probably takes a little while for social change, right?
Yeah.
The law is first, then slowly people start to comply. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, maybe we need penalties, we need compliance, we need other things, but eventually a colleague talks about the laws for seatbelts and how when that was passed, at first there was tons of opposition to it, and now it seems ridiculous that 4-year-old Darren was just rolling around in the back seat with his parents, probably chain smoking. There's all kinds of things in the 80s that we shouldn't do now and don't. But anyway, so I think that we're at that point where we've got the legislation in place, we're raising awareness, and we're just starting to see this groundswell of accessibility. And, you know, like the pushing, you know, the snowball down a hill, it gets bigger and bigger and builds speed. And Manitoba was the second province to bring in legislation, followed by Nova Scotia, followed by British Columbia, Newfoundland, Labrador, Saskatchewan. Now we're seeing all the provinces work on it. So that momentum, that groundswell is exciting to see. And one of the features, I don't know what your perspective would be, Lucia, but one of the features of the act that's important is it requires organizations to remove barriers.
Oh, yeah.
And those organizations need to do their own policy work, and they need to have accessibility plans. So to me, again, it's government can only do so much.
Yes.
The policing and the penalties will only do so much. You need organizations to take that on. And I don't know if you want to talk a bit about accessibility planning.
Yeah, and just to like build on what you said, Darren, like, yeah, it's so neat. We're a small province, Manitoba, right? And it's just so, I always remember as we do our work that we were the second province in all of Canada after Ontario to pass this legislation.
True.
And it was passed unanimously in the legislature. So there's a lot of support for, you know, from across the political spectrum on it.
Great point, yeah.
And I agree with Darren. I think this is such an exciting field to be involved in 2025 because we're seeing other jurisdictions. The federal government just passed its Accessible Canada Act, right?
Yes.
We're seeing other provinces pass their legislation. And the beautiful thing is we connect with those colleagues, those counterparts. And so there is a real synergy taking place where we're learning from them. They're asking us a lot of questions because we've been at it for some time, for about 10 years. So it's really an exciting time. But as Darren said, there's a lot of work still to be done. It's also about just taking stock of the progress that's being made as well.
Right.
So I think maybe one of the barriers that we've encountered is, as Darren said, organizations need to develop policies. Public sector organizations have to develop written accessibility plans. And then we know that in Manitoba, there are over 40,000 organizations that are subject to the legislation.
Wow.
So it's a large number of organizations that need to know what is outlined in the regulations and what to do. So that's a big number. And there are limited resources.
That's true.
So they're increasing the resources that we have, and that's a really positive thing. But we have to be strategic too in where we want to really earmark our efforts as a starting point. So that's one of the maybe the barriers, if you will, that we're aware of, and little by little we're getting more resources.
Amazing reflections, and of course I think from the conversation that we're having now, I have so many reflections but also questions that are coming to my mind. First of all, I do appreciate how you brought up the timeline, because it tells us, and like you have said, even though we have developed from what it was to what it's now, we could see that those regulations and standards that were developed at the time, even though they did give us a strong foundation to build upon, but now things are changing. And when things are changing, needs are changing. So now we do have, you talk about income support, you talk about compliance. The compliance or the standards for income or equity at that time is so much different when it comes to now. I know when I was working with the city, when it comes to compliance with some of these building codes, you're right, Darren, and so as you, Lucia, when you mentioned that it's not just the government that could do everything. We need to have some standards, and maybe some of these are standards, or I think policies and guidelines need to come to these organizations as well, because we cannot enforce everyone and all the time. Of course, government can only enforce to public buildings to the point that when it's needed. But what about private development? There's nothing that we could do at, beyond what a government can do.
It's one of the big gaps we hear from the community for sure, is about indoor spaces and private residences or historical buildings and that sort of thing. So absolutely, you're right. And I think one of the barriers to the policy work and the legislative work, it's the same as dealing with an accessibility barrier at your home or work, or it's the same. It's not one size fits all.
Absolutely.
So one of the barriers to doing good legislation is you need to consult, right? Nothing about us without us, right? And that motto exists in the disability community for a reason, and that's because an accessibility feature or a modification for somebody who's blind may not be the appropriate modification for someone who's deaf. Or even you might think that Braille works. Well, that works for some people if they learned Braille, but if I become blind tomorrow, I'm probably not going to learn Braille just because of my own intellectual shortcomings. It would be very difficult for me at this age to learn it. So you can't assume, and you need to ask. And so government needs to go out and consult. So hopefully we get it right, but it also means it's possibly painfully slow for people who want that accommodation now and they want the change now. So I understand that frustration and we hear it, and obviously we're not the decision makers for government, but we help do some of those consultations, and so that's very important that we hear and we learn, and we're don't have the solutions, we ask for the solutions. The other problem a government's going to have is you also have stakeholders who maybe perceive these accommodations as being at best maybe difficult or expensive, and at worst unnecessary. So there is a bit of that education, public education and training that has to go into it to explain. We often say, accessibility isn't just the right thing to do from a moral, compassionate perspective. Like it is, but it's also the law. So it's the right thing from a legal perspective. And I think the argument that also has to get communicated and bust myths is that it doesn't cost extra necessarily, or it's a lot less expensive if you build it right up front and you don't have to modify it later. So a $5,000 investment into a house, let's say, where you have light switches lower, you have doors wide enough, you have a ramp to get in, it maybe isn't a fully accessible house, but it's visitable. Your family and friends can come. Those things are very inexpensive if you do it at the front end. So I think that's another important feature of our act, is that it's proactive. We're not waiting for complaints to come in. We're telling organizations, to be an employer who is accessible, you must do these things. So I think that's an important feature.
And one of the unique aspects, we've developed a compliance framework that's actually publicly available for Manitobans to read. And one of the key features of this compliance framework is to always start by working collaboratively with organizations. So if we get a complaint, say, about an organization, the first thing we'll do is connect with that organization to raise awareness about the requirement, because we know they may not actually be aware that doing X is a requirement, for example. So that's always a starting point, and we help them, we answer questions that organizations might have. Darren's office develops tools and resources such as frequently asked questions documents or guidelines. So it's really about, at first, really working in good faith with the organization and making sure that there's a really positive interaction. And it's only when the attempt to work collaboratively with organizations doesn't work, and an organization is what we call willfully non-compliant, that then we have the ability in this framework to think about issuing orders to remedy contraventions or penalties. So it's a spectrum, so to speak. We don't start right away with the heavy-handed tools that we have in our toolkit.
Love that. All of these points are so incredibly important, especially when we talk about compliance, because as you have said, when we talk about just, having these policies being initiated or implemented out of compassion, it's not going to work out. That's why laws are there, because it enforces that right to be implemented so that people could live with equal opportunities and could actually have something to look forward to. Because living with a disability is not an easy task. It becomes overwhelming at times where, the world is fast moving. And when we talk about, I do want to go back to one of the points that you mentioned, Darren, that was about when we talk about vision loss community. And you've mentioned that, maybe we think that introducing just Braille could be, the solution to whatever the issue that we are trying to resolve. That might not be helpful to everyone who belongs to that community. Like you've said, it's not one that fits all. It's about asking, not assuming. And that's where, when Lucia, you mentioned that this is an exciting sector, because it actually encourages you to, critically think about different ideas. It's about creative thinking. It's about always reaching out to your stakeholders and finding some solutions. And I think when we talk about some of these practices, I understand that getting together with all of the stakeholders is also not an easy task. But what about other professionals and expertise that you require, your offices require, to keep moving with all of the feedbacks that you're receiving? Because we have to be mindful of the fact that most of this information that comes in is not quantitative data. That could be, just put it in Excel and, figure out a formula and, bam, that's all done. It's qualitative data where you have to, have those coding done. You have to analyze it thoroughly. So how do you work with that? Do you have enough resources, or, how are you planning to work with those limitations, I would say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we have to probably say we don't have enough resources, like that's a given. So it's about maximizing and doing what we can. But as we talked about off the start, accessibility is everybody's responsibility. So all organizations need to participate. So internally, we're lucky. We have an Accessibility Advisory Council here in Manitoba. They advise the government on accessibility issues, and they have experts at their disposal. So they'll do a technical committee. If they need expertise, let's say the regulation that was just passed on information and communication, it gets very technical about what websites need to be, and there's website standards for accessibility, and things like font size, color contrast, so people with low vision can access it. If you're blind, screen readers can read it. There's all kinds of technical requirements. So we don't have that expertise. We're not website designers. So we access that through our technical committees. Government accesses that through their technical committees, which is great. But you bring up that if you were an organization, if you were, Manitoba Sport, you maybe don't have that technical expertise anyway. So where do you go? So Manitoba, we have the Manitoba Accessibility Fund. We're lucky enough to have a grant program. And it was started with a $20 million investment. And then each year we give out about $1 million in grants to organizations. And the grants are up to $50,000 for projects related to accessibility. So if you need to update your website to the current standards to be compliant with the law, you can apply for a grant. Then you can hire any web developer in Manitoba.
Great.
Show them the law, this is what we need to meet, and they'll build you that. So you don't need to have the expertise, especially if you're a nonprofit, small businesses, you're not gonna have maybe the money to invest in a new website right now. You can apply for grants. We're on our 4th year. So far we've funded 130 projects, if you count this year's that are about to get announced, 130 projects for about $3 million in Manitoba. And it's amazing, and it covers, things like websites or information communication, big things like, big ticket items that might cost $50,000 like that, or small ticket items. You're a small organization or club and you're holding a general meeting and you want to have American Sign Language interpreters. So you need $1,000 to make your event accessible. You can apply for a grant to make your event accessible. So we funded schools, libraries, municipalities, businesses, arts and theaters. So there's a lot of great work going on to build in accessibility features into something like a theater. If you go to a theater, it speaks to the one size fits all. You might have a disability, and because of your disability, you might get anxious, or something in the play might set you off. So you need to leave, and normally you're not allowed back in theaters. Like that's so it shows you where a barrier is a sort of a historic structural barrier. No one said you're not allowed to come back because you are a person with a disability. They're not, but it becomes a barrier.
Yeah.
So there are more casual nights, and then that way what night you can go, because if this happens to you or something, you need to leave. But everybody benefits from that. So if you're, a new mom and you're nursing, you can go and you can leave if you have to, right? So it's an example where accommodation and sort of that universal design concept comes from. Don't design it so 70% of us can access it.
Yes.
Design it so 98%, 99%, and you maybe never can accommodate every single person, but work towards it. Like the more we get there, it benefits all of us. I think we all push the automatic doors when we have our hands full, right? So accommodations do benefit all of us, and it's not just about removing the barrier for the person with disability. That's our focus, removing barriers, but it does help, I think, everybody.
And it's also about, I think, removing attitudinal barriers, right?
Yeah.
I think that's really important. And it's what we often do when we get calls from organizations who are just not sure what to do in a specific situation in relation to, say, an accommodation or a request for accessible customer service in a restaurant.
Yeah.
We always say, and I think we've touched upon this, but it's really important, is to have dialogue and not to assume that an accommodation has to be the same way all the time for a person with the same disability, right?
Yes.
Because disabilities are different. We might have the same disability, but we might encounter different barriers, right? They can be episodic, right? They can be long-term. So it's really about, I think what we try to stress is, it's really about those organizations getting increasingly comfortable having that conversation with the individual experiencing the barrier, and being comfortable in asking questions and saying, I'm not just, can I learn a little bit from you, right? Like, what is that you need, right?
Love it.
Yeah.
It's the shift in perspective. And even right now, I think having these conversations is basically breaking that stigma of, I know as a professional, and I'm pretty sure that you could also relate to it, talking about accessibility and universal design sometimes really gets overwhelming, because it's not the fear, but it's about, oh my God, I don't know what's going to come next, because it's vast. Like there's no specific areas. And I'm so happy that you mentioned this, Lucia. People having same disabilities can have multiple different, situational, episodic, or maybe temporary, or some people might have permanent needs, which evolve, which changes. And it's actually a good thing and a bad thing in a way, that if you provide an environment which is now, accommodating their needs. So now they have evolving needs because that was something that they never were used to before. But now they're using it, and now there are more needs coming up. So it's about having those dialogues. It's about having those communications. And I really love the fact that even though, because you do belong to the compliance, secretariat, but that's the penalties. But right now we are also talking about incentivization. So MAF, the Manitoba Accessibility Fund, is a great way to do that. And even though we might be having, or the government might be having, limitations in terms of resources, expertise, I think this is a great initiative where you're allowing different organizations to step up.
That's right.
And I do remember that in one of the conversations you did mention that, Darren, that people are not waiting for the government to introduce policies.
Absolutely.
They are just stepping up.
Yeah, that's what we're
a
seeing,
great
and we're seeing
initiative.
it. There's still a lot of work we need to do to raise awareness about the legislation and get the word out and make sure people know, especially organizations, know how to remove barriers and be compliant with the legislation. But the first couple of regulations that came out, when we would go and do presentations, it was new to people.
Yeah.
They were asking questions. This was new. What we found with the information communication, which was our third regulation, we were getting phone calls from companies 2 years, 3 years before they had to comply. They were calling us saying, how do I make an accessible website? What do I need to do? So they had already been aware of the law. They were already looking into how to be compliant, even though their compliance date was 3 years out. So that was amazing. The transportation standard, which has been passed, and most of the requirements come into place in 2027. So things like buses and paratransit, ride shares like taxis and Ubers. There's laws in place now for all of those. Well, Winnipeg Transit was part of that technical committee, and they've already started implementing these changes to buses. And there's not much left for them to do because they've been proactive and working along. So we're seeing organizations, they're not waiting for the law to be passed. We just had a webinar and had folks from parks come and talk about accessible parks and recreation trails and yurts and camping sites. And the outdoor spaces standard hasn't been written yet. The law is still being developed. They're already meeting or exceeding on new builds and new things. They're already trying to do those things. So it's top of mind for people, and I think that's great. It's part of that momentum and part of that snowball gaining speed and getting bigger. It's certainly a trend that we're seeing from the proactive side of it. And I think from the reactive side, Lucia, would you say like most of the organizations you are dealing with, if they aren't compliant, like they work really hard to become compliant? Very few are resistant.
Yes, so one of the things we do in our office is when we notice that an organization is not complying with a specific requirement under a regulation, so say hypothetically, we know an organization is a large entity, a large employer in Manitoba, and we can't seem to locate their accessible customer service policy. What we'll do is we'll connect with them to let them know it's a requirement, work with them, right? And then what we do is we issue what we call an achieving compliance plan to them by email with a deadline by which we want to see the policy. And since 2021, I think we've issued 268 of these achieving compliance plans. And in the past years, the average has been that about 87% of those organizations comply.
Wow.
So what that shows us is that once organizations know about what they're required and they have initial contact with our office, that they really are willing to comply. And that's really positive. It's that small percentage of organizations, so that 15%, that we need to look into a little bit more and think, okay, do we need to, issue an order? And then if that order is not, abided to, then do we need to issue a penalty?
Right.
So the positive thing is that we've worked in the past 3-4 years with a lot of organizations in different sectors, the business sector, nonprofit, public sector, and it's been really encouraging to see that there is an interest in meeting the legislation and being more accessible.
Right. Yeah, and it's really a great balance, because penalties are important, because there are just so many organizations and businesses who would not understand otherwise. But incentivization is balancing it off. Like, we are giving you the opportunity to be creative, step up and do something, and we are here to help. So this is a great initiative, but if you're not willing to do it, then you would have to, just deal with the repercussions, which is important, because accessibility is not just one term, and it often gets misrepresented, misunderstood, or underrepresented, because there are just so many aspects to it. And I think when it comes to compliance, even though checking off some of those marks on our checklist is important, but there are just so many other hidden layers that need to be complied with. For example, trainings. We do need staff training. We do need even our decision makers. They need to have a proper training. I mean, you did mention that was a very honest remark, that we are not experts in that, and that's why we need that support. And there's nothing wrong in that. Even these experts are not specializing in all the aspects. So you have to go to different areas or different stakeholders to get that perspective. So it's about training. It's about, having that enhanced, comprehensive, but holistic training, which is lacking for sure. But it's not just Manitoba. That's pretty much everywhere. And attitudinal changes would come through that training, because our frontline staff, it's all about top to bottom. We need everyone to be in alignment if, when they're serving our customers, our public. And I think this has all been great conversation. It's really enlightening, and you have shared so many great things that are happening, that are coming up, or have been ongoing so far. I think the last thing that the last topic that I would like to talk about on this podcast, and because there's just so many things that we could go into depth, and we will need to have multiple podcasts. It's about the rising population of our aging population. And it's not just happening in Manitoba, it's happening Canada-wide, and also for people who are living with lived disabilities. So what are you thinking about? I mean, if I have to ask about recreational items, because we don't want these older adults who have committed or contributed to our society or community for so long being left out. I know that Manitoba has been pretty active, Winnipeg has been pretty active, but would you like to share what's going on? Like, what are these great initiatives that you are aware of, or where, Manitoba government have maybe partnered or maybe supported some of these businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as we've been saying, accessibility is really everyone's responsibility. So there's pockets of great work going on in a number of organizations across the province, some funded by the Manitoba Accessibility Fund, but other organizations, what we noted is even organizations, unfortunately, the fund has to say no to more applications than it can say yes to, because we get about 190 applications each year, and we can only fund 30. So what we found, though, is a number of those organizations went ahead with their project anyway. So they found a different funding source, they got donations, or they just built it into their funding. So it's amazing that work is happening. But your question, it's a great question, and it hints at so many things, because one of the things we know is that the number of people with disabilities is rising. According to Stats Can, the last stat was 29.2. So almost 30% of Manitobans have a disability. So that's a huge number. And I think another way to look at that is all of us, we either have a disability, we're going to acquire a disability in our life, or we know someone with a disability. So if an organization, they maybe have an accessibility feature like an automatic door, but it's broken and they haven't fixed it, and Lucia gets a complaint, it's not about maybe the one individual who has a mobility aid that can't get in. It's that, well, their family's not going to come to your establishment, to your restaurant, so you're losing business from 10, 20, 100 people, not just the one person.
Yes.
So it's really easy to make that argument.
Yeah.
So we've seen a number of great recreation projects. There was Winterpeg is for Everyone was the name of it. Winnipeg Trails put it on, and it was an opportunity, was an event put on in the winter, and now I understand there's some further work being done to make it sort of more permanent, but it was an event in the winter so people could come out and try different adaptive technologies, different things for winter recreation, and they made it available. They had people there, they trained staff and volunteers so that they could show people how to use equipment, which was great. The Manitoba Accessibility Fund also sponsored a sport expo, so people could go out and try different para sports, so sledge hockey and other things. So part of it is just encouraging people, if you want to try it, go try it. I tried wheelchair basketball. I'm really terrible at basketball and really terrible at a wheelchair. So you put the two together and I could not really coordinate. But it gives you that chance. If you're thinking about trying something, it sort of gives you that push. Sometimes we need a nudge to come out and try something. Yeah. And like you said, training is important. So training the volunteers so they know this is how you might have to handle things. This is how you use the adaptive technology or the equipment for that sport. That's really great. I know Manitoba Swim Club, I forget their exact name, but they had a website project and a project to make some of their pieces more accessible so people could access it, because they do have swimming programs for people who are blind or visually impaired, people with intellectual disabilities, and people with physical disabilities who want to swim. There's courses, there's opportunities for you to do that, right? So there's all kinds of great work going on. The Manitoba Accessibility Fund also funds seniors organizations who also wanted to make some of their information more accessible, or websites, those types of things. Right. So it's getting the information out there, and again, as we said, people aren't waiting for the law. I think if you go and you see, many organizations that work with seniors or work with people with disabilities or both, you'll see that they're probably ahead of the law as far as they're exceeding the accessibility requirements, and that's great to see.
Yeah.
So those are just a couple projects. I know there's great work going on at the municipality levels, because they also receive grants for community centers and those types of things. That it's, hopefully it's that attitudinal stuff. Hopefully accessibility isn't an afterthought. This is something at the design phase when you're first starting. You're thinking about it, you're building it in, and you're making it so everybody can participate and not just 70% of us.
Right. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Right. That's such I think we are ending on such positive notes. And not to mention that Manitoba is also ahead in sports in so many ways. Yep. And when it comes to para sports, of course, Manitoba is trying to, have these voices and faces being brought up. I know that within Canada, there are some provinces, of course, when it comes to some other bigger organizations, which are basically devoted to specific disabilities, how they collaborate with different news channels and different organizations to introduce these sports, which are accessible.
Yeah, and I think, maybe another point to make, and because you asked about recreation, and that is an important piece, but it's also, to your point earlier about holistic. Yes. How are you going to get there? And so if you don't have an accessible transit system, how are you going to access those recreational opportunities or places? So the Outdoor Public Spaces Standard, which we're working on right now, is a part of the solution. The transportation, accessible transportation, is part of it. So again, the Outdoor Spaces Standard is going to address things like parking lots. So if you have 50 spaces, how many accessible spaces do you need? How wide do they need to be? So at least you can park at the beach. Yep. But then you're not just going to sit in your car, you want to access the water. So you're going to need to have those Moby mats to get down to the beach, right? So there are accessibility features all the way along the continuum. It's not just about going to the beach. Right. It's where are you going to park? How are you going to get there? Is there a washroom there? Like, it's all of these things factor in. And so you see the puzzles coming together in Manitoba. It's not just about having an act or transportation standard or outdoor. Suddenly it's all coming into focus. It's really that holistic approach.
Yep. This is something I cannot stop myself from you know, talking or taking that point from you and then talking about it. It's the washrooms. People have traumatic experiences, or there are some, you know, recreational spaces where people have had this trauma bond, which is now healing because these businesses or these new initiatives are bringing more accessible washrooms to those places.
For sure.
So how some of these initiatives, or maybe most of these initiatives, are bringing healing to the journey, which seldom gets, you know, missed.
Absolutely. And for outdoor spaces, when that law is in place, if you're holding an event, if you're holding a festival, if you're holding a concert or something at the park, you're going to need to make sure you have an accessible washroom, because that's in the law, right? So that you know, as a person who needs that service, it's going to be there, built in proactively, right? And so I think that's very important. And, you know, I think that's the outdoor spaces, it's such a broad, because it covers parking lots and beaches and boat launches and pedestrian crossings, and it gets very technical.
Yes.
But I think it's going to be great for Manitoba to have that law in place.
Absolutely. And one of the provinces who have already initiated standards for outdoor spaces, I think it's about time that Manitoba gets into it. And we had these conversations about accessible events. So maybe that's something that Manitoba could also take a lead on. So this is something that, you know, we could always keep discussing, keep having these dialogues. It was a pleasure talking to both of you, having you share your valuable inputs and projects that are ongoing. And thank you for all of your work, because we do need people who are invested in making these changes. Because I know as a professional, we seldom get scared about, you know, oh my God, accessibility, we are not going to talk about it. But I think maybe this sort of conversation and dialogues might have changed some perspective, might open more avenues to open dialogues like these. So thank you once again, and thank you, Multicultural, for having us, giving us this platform to continue these conversations. Till then, thank you and goodbye.